Good morning.
Morning.
Before we jump into the Shiur, wanted to mention that Torah Anytime is having their annual campaign. Many of you are aware of this, and they actually sent to all the speakers a little plaque expressing appreciation and how many hours of listening each speaker had over the year and over their career on Torah Anytime. It's really incredible to see, how many hundreds of thousands of hours each speaker is generating. So obviously contributing to the campaign is a real form of Harbatas HaTorah. Definitely spreading Torah throughout the world in a very real way. So those of you who are here, those of you who are listening online, I encourage you all to participate on my page, of course. Okay, the topic is, can I ask a second opinion regarding halacha? Now, when you think about it, when it comes to the world of healthcare, if there's any serious question, generally the hadracha is, okay, maybe it's kedai to get a second opinion to make sure that this approach makes sense. We take halacha very seriously, so there's definitely a strong rationale to say that perhaps it makes sense, perhaps I'm even obligated to ask a second opinion to make sure I'm doing the right thing. After all, this is the Ratzon Hashem. I want to make sure I'm doing the Ratzon Hashem appropriately. Now, we've all heard of the concept of you can't go fishing for a heter. If you ask one rabbi and he says it's asur, to then go and try to ask other opinions, that's inappropriate. Well, where does that come from? Is that true? And why is it inappropriate? Maybe part of my rationale is that I'd rather this shaila be mutter than asur, but maybe part of the rationale is I want to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. So that's the discussion this morning. There are two major Gemaras here. There's a Gemara Nida and Daf Chaf Amud Beis, where it speaks about Yalta. Yalta was the wife of Rav Nachman, very chashuv tzadekis. So Yalta Aisi Doma Lakamei de Rabba Bar Chana. She had a shaila, and she brought her shaila to Rabba Bar Chana, v'tamila, and he looked at it and he said, Tameya. Ais Lakamei de Rav Yitzchak Brei de Rav Yehuda, and then she brought the shaila to Rav Yitzchak Brei de Rav Yehuda, v'dachila, and he said it's tahara, that you're okay. So the Gemara has a question: V'heichi ovid hachi? How was Rav Yehuda? How was Rav Yitzchak Brei de Rav Yehuda allowed to paskin differently than the first psak of Rabba Bar Chana? V'hatanya, we have a brayso: Chacham sheti me'ein chaver shayla taher. If you have a posek that says something is tameh, so the second posek is not allowed to come along and say, really, it's tahor. Asar, if the first Rav says something's asar, ein chaver shayla hatir. Second Rav can't come along and say it's mutter. So the question is, how was Rav Yitzchak Brei Rav Yehuda allowed to say tahora after she already received the psak that it's tameya?
First of all, you see, the Gemara wasn't asking on her how she allowed this.
Oh, very good. Good point.
How is he allowed to do that? That means based on the Gemara's question, she told him, I got a psak from a different Rav differently.
So we're going to see that in a moment, but I think that first point you made is very valid. There's no question on Yalta herself, hey, what are you doing? You already got a ruling from the first Rav. How are you asking the question again? You're fishing for a heter. It sounds like the only issue is, how could the second Gemara paskin against the first Gemara? So the Gemara says as follows. So mi'ikara tamua havim mitamala. That really Yalta brought the shaila to Rav Yitzchak Brei Rav Yehuda, and it sounds like she shared with him that she already asked the shaila to Rabbi Bar Chana, and he said it was tamei, and therefore right away he said it's tamei as well. However, then she explained to him that I have this type of shaila often, and I always bring this shaila to Rabbi Baruch Hana, and generally he says that it's not a problem, it's tahora. However, today I saw when I brought him the shaila, va'idna hu dechosh be'enei. I saw that he had a headache and he wasn't feeling well, and I was concerned maybe he wasn't able to assess it appropriately, and that's why I'm bringing the shaila to you. And then after hearing that, Rav Yitzchak, brother of Yehuda, said, oh, in that case, I'll tell you what I really think, it's tahora. So the Gemara is basically telling us that Rav Yitzchak, brother of Yehuda, told her initially, it's no good, when he heard that it's already paskindan. When she explained to him that she was concerned the psak that was given might not be accurate, so then he was willing to say his own opinion. The truth is, I feel it's tahora, and it sounds like because there's a real concern for a mistake, this would not be a violation of the concept of chacham shetime ein chaver rishai letaher. Sounds good so far? Okay. Now, initially, before he heard that maybe the first psak was made in error, why did he say it's tameya if he really felt it was tahora? So Rashi says, the pshita le de tahor, that initially Rav Yitzchak brother of Yehuda, obviously he felt it was tahor the whole time. However, the reason why he said initially it's tameya mishum kavodo de Rabba bar Barchana. It was based on having the proper respect for the first Rav. If he said it's tameya, I'm not going to tell you otherwise, even though I really feel it's tahora. Okay. So according to Rashi, it sounds like this whole issue of a second posek telling you something against the first posek is based in the realm of derech eretz. Not appropriate to contradict the ruling of the first Rav. Now Tosfos comes along and he's bothered by the question that Reb Chaim was bringing up. V'yesh makshal Yalta, heichi avdahachi. How is Yalta allowed to do this? How is she allowed to go search for a second opinion in the first place? We say in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah Daf Zayin, Hanisha l'chacham v'timei, lo yisha l'chacham v'yitaher. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah has a different presentation of this halacha. The Gemara Nida says that the second Rav cannot paskin against the first one. But the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, we'll reference this for a moment, very top here. Tanu Rabbanan initial l'chacham v'timei, lo yisha l'chacham v'yitaher. It seems to be focusing on the shoel. I, the person that have the question, so once I turn to one Rav and he says it's tameya or it's aser, then I can't ask a second opinion. So why are we not bothered here that Yalta was going and searching for a second opinion? So V'yesh Lomar Tosfos answers, Dekapeda lo havya shoel ela chacham. This concern of pasking against the first Rav is only on the second Rav, it's not on the shoel. HaShoel yisha l'chol ma sheyirtza. You have a shaila, you could ask as many people as you want.
Did you also see that Rabbi had a headache?
Oh, now the truth is, right, how is he answering the question? The question was, if you look at the wording in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, there the Gemara seems to be placing the hakpada not only on the second posek, but also on the person asking the question. Lo yisha l'chacham v'yitaher.
It sounds like this was the key point. Providing that you tell the second Rav that you already asked a different shaila and you got the psak. Because didn't say that before. It makes it sound like, go ahead, ask away.
Right, so Tosfos did not mention that explicitly, that there is a caveat that I'm only allowed to ask a second opinion if I inform the second opinion that I asked so-and-so and he said it's also or he said it's tameya. However, if you take a look at Tosfos in Avodah Zarah, he does spell this out clearly. Tosfos over here in Avodah Zarah and Daf Zayin says, V'chilo yisho l'cho chachamim v'yadunu ze im ze ulai yeshivu midavarav. Again, What's the big deal if I want to ask a second or a third or fourth opinion? And then there's more of a robust conversation, and maybe they're going to speak to the initial Rav who said otherwise, and let them hack it out. And maybe they'll come to a conclusion that the initial psak was incorrect. So v'yesh lomar deino aser ela l'shoel im lo yodiya lo kavar sha'alti leploni v'aser li. Here Tosfos says explicitly, the only time it's problematic for me to ask a second opinion is if I make no mention that I already asked the question. But if I come to the second Rav, I make another phone call, and I tell you, listen, the truth is, I already spoke to Rabbi so-and-so, and he told me Tameyo. He said it's Aser. However, I wanted to ask your opinion on this Shaila. Would you agree or disagree? Once you say that, it sounds like you're removing the entire burden from you. I'm allowed to ask the question again. I'm allowed to search for a second opinion.
So the headache was a non-factor for her. It was just for the second rabbi to do it.
The main issue here is, if I'm the second rabbi that you're coming to, am I allowed to paskin against the first rabbi? And generally the answer is, like we saw from the Brisa in Nida, I can't. Now, we also saw an exception, right? Because the exception in this case was, once Yalta told the second Amora that she thought the first one made a mistake because he wasn't feeling well, then he felt comfortable paskening against him. And there could be other exceptions as well, meaning if there's never a time or place where I, the second rabbi, am allowed to paskin against the ruling of the first rabbi, so then what are you doing asking the shaila? So shkoyach, you're allowed to ask the question, but if I can never paskin to the contrary of his psak, then the whole thing is a bracha levatala. So the answer is, there are times when I would be allowed to paskin against the ruling of the first Rav. We so far see one exception in Shas, namely, if I feel confident that what I'm seeing is 100% Tahora, and the reason why the first Amora said it's Tameya is because he made a mistake. Nebuch, he wasn't feeling well. That's one exception we see.
Is it not to go call the other up and have a conversation with them? It sounds like the language that they have to do this dialogue and prove it down.
So the way that Tosfos is saying it here in Avodah Zarah is, maybe the rationale in asking a second or even third, fourth opinion is that then there could be a real conversation and they could call the first Rav, but it doesn't sound like that's necessary. From our Gemara and Nida, doesn't seem like Rav Yitzchak bar Breid Rav Yehuda had to get in touch with Rabbi bar Barchana. It sounds like as soon as he heard that he wasn't feeling well, and to him it was clear that it was Tahara, he felt comfortable paskening.
Also, they told him that he usually does. That's psak.
What's that?
She told him that that's his usual psak.
And she did also mention that generally when I show him something like this, he says Tahara. Another yes.
So a person has, let's say, a bunch of a child that comes up often, right? They call their Rav usually, and the Rav usually says that this thing is working. Then he calls up and he feels that the Rav is very rushed on the phone.
Oh.
So you can call a different Rav and you can say, listen, call this Rav. He usually says
Hypothetically, very rushed, not having time for his congregants.
very rushed.
Chas v'sholom. So according to this, it would seem that if I have the question, right, what I feel is somewhat of a complicated basar b'chalav shaila, and I think I explained it pretty well to the Rav I usually ask these shailas to, but I did get the feeling that maybe he wasn't fully omid on the shaila, maybe he was involved with other things and not really giving it the yishuv hadas that it required. Would I be allowed to now call another Rav and say, I asked this question already, so I feel kind of awkward asking again. He told me that the whole thing is treif, but I got the feeling that maybe he didn't fully understand everything I was saying, and that's why I just wanted to ask the shaila to make sure. Would that be mutter or aser? Be mutter. Now the question is the second Rav allowed to pass it against the first Rav? That we're going to get more involved with. So far we've only seen one exception to that rule. Yes, doctor.
It's more like a comment observation. It seems like the Gemara is
all of that. Q&A, post-game, argument.
Oh, so Dr. Slode's making a very good point. Don't we find that all throughout Shas? Everyone's arguing with each other. So the answer is we do. However, and we're going to see this explicitly, there's never an issue when there's a question that comes up in the base medrash, and we have a conversation, and somebody raises a shaila, and my first thought is, hearing the back and forth, it should be mutter, it's fine. You have the Rashba, the Bisomechan, and you also have that second side of the Ran. In a case like this, it should be fine. And then you hear the same exact shaila, and I don't think the second side of the Ran even applies here, and the Rashba is not even quoted la halacha. I think it should be a problem. When we're having a discussion together, there's no issue whatsoever me arguing with you. It's encouraged and it's sacred. This whole shaila is, I first had a conversation with you without that rabbi around. I wasn't quite happy with the answer I received, so now I'm going to go to his base medrash and ask him. Right? Now, the question is, what's the rationale? Why is there a potential problem? So we saw Rashi, and Rashi seems to be saying it's in the world of derech eretz. It's not appropriate for the second rabbi to paskin against the first rabbi. Mishum kovodo shel rishon. The truth is, there is a machlokis in the Rishonim as to what exactly the issue is. So that's Shitas Rashi. The Ran, this is on page 2, this is the Ran in the very beginning of Avodah Zarah. The Ran quotes the opinion of the Ravid. And the Ravid says, Delo mishum kovodo shel rishum noguba. Don't think the second rabbi can't paskin against the first one because it's a lack of respect. That's not really what's happening here. Ela mishum de kivin de osra rishon. There's a whole different lumdus, which is, since the first rabbi said it's osr or it's tameh, shavya chaticha de isura, says the Ravid, this now becomes conceptually something that's osr. V'shuv ein la heter, dafilu hetiru hasheni eina muteris. To the extent where, let's say I ask Rabbi A, and he hears the question, and he says, I'm sorry, but the whole thing is treif. It's usher. What do I do with it? Throw it in the garbage. Okay. Then I hang up the phone. I'd rather not do that. Let me call Rabbi so-and-so. Okay. I call Rabbi so-and-so, and let's say I do nothing wrong. I inform him that I spoke to this Rab, and he said it's usher, it's treif. I wanted to ask your opinion. And for some reason, maybe he made a mistake and he forgot about this halacha. And he said, L'maisa, it's fine, it's mutter, enjoy. It should be a kiyum of oneg Shabbos, no problem. Okay. So now here I am. I'm in the middle. So am I allowed to rely on that heter? So the Ravid says the whole concept here is, once you're given a psak that something is asr, conceptually speaking, we view either the item that I was asking on or the action that I was asking can or can I not do. Shavya chaticha de isura, this becomes asr. Now, if it's really mutter objectively, how did the rabbi make it asr? And this is a very intricate, subtle question. There's a whole beautiful tshuva of the Netziv who tries to explain what the Ravid means. General concept seems to be that if I'm turning to you and I want a real psak, I'm not asking an academic question. I'm learning Yeridea right now, and in the base medrash we had the following question, right? If you have 16 spoons and 3 of them are treif, I'm asking a real question. And you paskin for me that it's asr, so because I'm basically accepting your psak upon myself, so then there's a din, almost like a neder, but whatever you say I'm going to go with. If you paskin it's asr, it's asr. And now when the second rabbi comes along and says, it's not a problem, it's kosher, enjoy it, that ruling is not binding b'chlal. I can't rely on that even if I wanted to, because this item was already deemed usher. That's the approach of the Ravid. So that's a great question, meaning let's say the second rabbi calls up the first Rav. Right, let's say the second rabbi didn't forget the whole discussion, and he understands that it's not so pashut the paskin that it's mutter when the first one said it's usher. So he picks up his phone, he calls the first Rav, and they have a back and forth, and it turns out that Lemaisa, the first Rav hears where the second Rav is coming from. I didn't read the Shach like that, I'm not convinced you're right, but I definitely hear, yeah, okay, I would agree that you could be Mekel. Does that change the equation? According to the Ravid, it wouldn't even change the equation. Because this concept of chaticha de isura, this was made usher based on that Rav's psak. What's that?
How does that understand the Gemara?
Oh, so how does the Ravid understand the Gemara? Great question. So the only time where we would say that that first ruling is not binding is if it's mamish based on a mistake. Right? And there's different Lashonos we find in the poskim, in the Rishonim. So if it's a question of shikol hadas, which means I'm not sure, I could hear this way, you could hear that way, and we're having a machlokus, so then, even if the first one retracts, it's not going to help according to the Ravid, because the psak itself is not illegitimate. It's be'etzim has chashivas. Maybe he is right. If, however, it's clear that it was a mistake, and that could be the case of the Gemara, so then that first psak does not have that same status of making the item musr. Does that make sense?
What if the first question is asked as a hypothetical?
So
But
then
you rely on
yes,
the
if the
psak.
first question was asked as a hypothetical, so then I would not be bound by that psak. Right? Person comes to you and says, I'm not asking halacha l'maisa. Right? I just want to know what you would say in a case like this. So then the Rav would say, shkoyach.
Even though you just did that. Like, let's say you have in your
No, the Howard's saying that maybe if the first time I asked the shaila, I presented as a
No,
hypothetical.
it's a real case, but I'm presenting it as a hypothetical because
Listen.
I'm worried that it's going to be.
So
I'm not gonna get
even
the
if it's a
legal
real
thing.
case, but my mindset is, I'm not accepting his ruling upon myself, right? I'm my own man. I'll choose what psak I want to follow, and we'll see how healthy that is. But, listen, I want to hear his opinion. He's a learned rabbi. I want to hear what you have to say. So then, l'chora, I'm not bound by that psak, l'chora. But I want to get clarity, though, on the different reasons given in the Rishonim. We had Rashi. Rashi said the reason why the second Rav can't pass it against the first Rav is because it's not derech eretz. The Ravid seems to be saying something drastically different, that once the first Rav says it's usher, you can't touch it. And even if you tell me it's mutter, I can't listen to that because the first ruling is binding.
It sounds like it has to be take effect on something concrete.
So the truth is, right, Safran's asking a good question. In the Ravid's world, is this limited to when I'm asking a question on something tangible? But it's clear from the poskim, and there's a sefer, the Chut Shani, of Nisan Korelit spells this out in length. It's not based on having something that's tangible that I want to know is a mutter or usher. It sounds like even an action that I'm exploring, can I do this? That psak is binding on the Maisa itself. If I turn to the first Rav and I want to ask a real, sincere question, and I have in mind I'm going to accept his answer, and he tells me that it's usher for me to do this Maisa, that Maisa becomes usher also.
Is that story of Moshe, as you know, that somebody came to him and said, ask him different, and they said, oh, yeah, different tshuva many years ago, and he said, oh, Maslotas.
Okay, we'll have to analyze how that story fits in.
Okay.
Okay, no, we'll get there maybe. That's an interesting application.
Is there a difference? Maybe this question is premature. Is there a difference between halacha and hashkafa?
So in not premature, is there a difference between halacha and hashkafa? So we're going to get there as well, Amit Hashem. I guess that means it is premature. But by saying we're going to get there is a nicer way than saying it's premature.
Not premature to ask, it's premature to answer.
Exactly. However, the Ran himself, and we're not going to go through the rayas that or the kashas he has in the Ravid, but the Ran himself says that, my opinion, this whole discussion of the second Rav not being able to paskin against the first Rav is mipnei kavodo shel rishon, is like Rashi said, it's a lack of derech eretz. And he also adds another svara, which is va'od, last paragraph in the Ran, kedei shelo tira Torah kishtei toros halalu osrim halalu matirim. The optics are not healthy. The idea of, this Rav says mutter, this Rav says aser, and everyone has different opinions, it just becomes a hefkerus. Do whatever you want, make up your own Yiddishkeit, you could ask any. So the Ran seems to be taking a more practical approach, similar to Rashi. The reason why the second Rav can't paskin against the first one is mishum kavodo shel rishon, and overall it doesn't create a healthy system in Klal Yisrael.
It doesn't actually change the item itself, whatever it's being done.
Right, meaning according to the Ran and Rashi, it sounds like they wouldn't agree to the Ravid's idea that when the first Rav says it's aser, somehow this now, to me, the shoel becomes aser. Of dafka. I want to go through a few nafkaminas, right? A few very interesting potential differences between the Ravid and the Ran.
In the Rav of the world, would it be also for everybody or just for the person who asked the Shiloh?
In the Ravid's world, it sounds like it would only be an issue for the person who asked the Shiloh. And you're saying, according to Rashi and the Ran, even if you were the one to ask Rabbi so-and-so, and he said it's aser for you,
Everybody, because it's still there.
so you could argue for me, he never made it aser for me, so maybe I could ask a second one in the Ravid. In the Ran, he might still say that's a lack of derech eretz. Nice. Potentially. I had three other nafkaminas as well. All right? Let's take the case where the first Rav doesn't say tameya or asura, but he says, it's mutter and ganzen, don't worry, it's poshit. And now this is not so common, right? This is a hypothetical question. The person's a little bit, is your Shemayim or OCD, whatever it is, I'm not so comfortable with assuming it's mutter. Or he thinks, okay, or maybe he feels the first Rav maybe got something wrong. And now he goes and he asks a second opinion. And the second opinion, right, and the Shoel says, I did learn the sugya, I don't know all the nuances and ins and outs, all I know is one thing, I'm allowed to ask a second rabbi as long as I tell you that I already asked the first rabbi. And it happens to be the first rabbi said it's mutter, but I just wanted to double check. I don't feel so comfortable with that psak. Is the second rabbi allowed to say, assuming he feels this is true, is he allowed to say, I would disagree vehemently. This is aser.
In the Ravid's world, isn't the object
in the Ravid's world, this whole idea of making something aser, accepting upon myself your ruling, that's only true when you're making something a chaticha de isura. So the Ravid would say, if the first Rav says the whole thing is mutter, there's no problem whatsoever in the second Rav coming along and saying, I'm sorry, it's aser.
The status never changed of the first psak?
Never changed by the first psak. There was never a status given to this thing of being off limits. The first rabbi just felt there was no problem. In the Ravid's world, there would be no problem whatsoever for the second Rav to come along and say, I'm sorry, it's aser. That's one nafkamina. According to Rashi and the Ran, if the whole issue is mishum kavodo shel rishon, it's a lack of derech eretz, it makes no difference if the first one said aser or mutter. Bottom line is for me to now come along and contradict him, that's inappropriate. Right? So that's one interesting nafkamina between these two opinions. A second nafkamina would be potentially, let's say the first one rules that the thing is aser. That's our case, right? Classic case. First one says aser, and therefore I want to get a second opinion. I'm looking for someone to say it's really mutter. And I come to you, and you tell me Even though I told you that I already asked the Shaila, some reason you're convinced, I don't care, I'll argue with him, it's mutter. So where do I stand now? Do I have two separate opinions that I could rely on and they're both binding? In the Ravid's world, the Ravid would say the second opinion is null and void. It was already chaticha d'isura. Second Rav saying it's mutter doesn't do anything. In the world of the Ran and Rashi, l'chora, maybe it was a lack of derech eretz to paskin against the first Rav, but now I, the person asking the question, I have two valid opinions. I have one chashuv Rav saying it's aser, I have one chashuv Rav saying it's mutter, and they're both equally legitimate. So what do I do in that case? So then it probably depends on what we're going to see in a moment, that if it's a shayla v'diraisa, safek diraisa l'chumra. If it's a shayla v'dirabanan, then maybe I could say safek dirabanan l'kula. But that's a second nafkamina between the Ran and the Ravid, is that in the Ran's world, the second ruling, although it may have been inappropriate, is valid, and therefore it creates another opinion that I could rely on in certain situations. Let me say the third nafkamina, and then we'll get to your question, okay? Third nafkamina would be, let's say the first question is posed to, my local Orthodox rabbi, very erlich yid. I generally go to him for my halacha questions. And I ask him a question, he says aser, but there's something bothering me, I'm just not sure. First of all, it's a hard pill to swallow, it would be a real loss, and I'm not sure if he's 100% correct. I think it's a complicated question. So I said, you know what, I want to get a second opinion. And I pick up the phone and I call Reb Shmuel Kamenetsky. Okay, I want a second opinion. And I present the question, I spoke to my local Orthodox rabbi, he said it's problematic. I just wanted to get the Rosh Hashiva's Chavas Das. So, according to Rashi and the Ran, if the whole issue is that the second Rav can't paskin against the first one, it's a lack of derech eretz, so you could argue that might not apply in a case where the second opinion is of a whole different stature. Right? It's mamish a whole different league. Listen, I respect your Rav very much, very chashuv Rav, but if you're asking me, Rosh Shmuel Kamenetsky, for me to say otherwise is not a lack of derech eretz. In the Ravid's world, where it's not about derech eretz, if the first Rav paskin it's aser, so then he made it chaticha d'isura, and even someone of the stature of Shmuel Kamenetsky, he wouldn't be allowed to come along and say it's mutter. It's already ruled as aser. So these are three interesting nafkaminas between the Ran Rashi in contrast to the Ravid. Question, Rabbi Yitzchak.
I just wanted to ask, and maybe this is segue to Simon's question, which is my question before. I'm not premature there yet. So when someone, Alan asked about is the item usher.
One more time. What's that? What's that?
If the first rabbi says it's mutter, there's no change in the outcome. Remember the rabbi once speaking about some commentary from Mishnah that said default position is that something is mutter unless otherwise usher. Is that what we can clean out from this? Or is that an exception?
So that happens to be a true hashkafa. That generally speaking, the way we view the world is that Kadosh Baruch Hu created a world for us to benefit from, and the status quo is it's mutter unless proven otherwise. But here, the whole starting point is there's a suffix, right? We're not sure if it's aser or it's mutter, and that's why I'm asking a shayla. Once I asked a shayla to the first Rav, that's where you have these at least three and potentially many more nafkaminas between the Ravid and the Ran. Okay, so how do we paskin? So you take a look at the Ramah, this is top of the page 3. There are two places in Shulchan Aruch that get heavily involved with the general guidelines of how do we paskin, going through so many different scenarios, and stam, and yesh omrim, and two yesh omrims, and This shaila of one chacham says asur, can I say it's mutter? One place is in Yeridea, in Reish Mem Beis, and the second place is in Choshen Mishpat Simin Chaf Hey. This is the Ramah in Yeridea, Reish Mem Beis, Sif Lamed Aleph. The Ramah quotes the Gemara and says, Chacham she'asar ein chaver rishai lahater mishikol hadas. If the first Rav says it's asar, the second Rav is not allowed to say it's mutter if they're only debating a shikol hadas, meaning I'm not convinced the first one made a mistake. I just have a different approach to the sugya. You're not allowed to paskin differently. Ulachein, I'm sorry, one more line before that. V'afilu im ta b'shikol hadas, yochel lisa v'litin im hamora ad sheyachzer bo. Okay, he says that let's say the second Rav feels the first one made a mistake in shikol hadas, where it wasn't clear that he made a mistake, but I do feel that he missed the cheshbon. There was something that he didn't think about carefully. So then, if I have a conversation with the first Rav and he retracts his opinion, then I, the Shoel, I'm allowed to rely on the second opinion because the first one retracted his opinion. Now that's going more within the world of the Ran, who says the whole thing is based on Derech Eretz. The Ravids would say that unless you could show for sure the first one mamish made a mistake, even if he retracts his opinion, it's still asur. Ulachein ein isr l'shoel lisho l'shein. So the Ramah says, like we saw from Tosfos, there's no problem from the Shoel's standpoint to ask a second opinion. Ubilvad sheodia oso shikavar hora rishon lesor. As long as I inform you that I already asked the shaila and I was given the psak that it's asur, I'm allowed to ask a second opinion. V'chol zeh ba'oso hora atzma. Now here's a very important caveat to the whole discussion. These limitations, where and when they apply, is only on this exact shaila. Although b'maisa acher, but if it's a different question that comes up, even if it's based on the exact same issue, the same mar makomos, but it's a different live question, then it's pashut. I'm allowed to ask a second opinion. I don't have to mention anything that I already asked the shaila previously. And even if I do mention that, you, the second Rav, are able to paskin it's mutter. Meaning this notion of I'm bound to the first psak is only within this live shaila. Right? If I have a similar shaila 2 weeks later, I'm allowed to ask a different posek, and even if that posek knows that I had the shaila previously, he's allowed to paskin whatever he wants. Oh, so this definitely makes sense in the world of the Ravid, because in the Ravid's world, the whole notion is, I made this thing, or this Maisa Asr, this is a new Shaila. It sounds like, though, even in the world of the Ran and Rashi, you could argue, it's not the same lack of Derech Eretz. I'm not arguing on this psak that was given to you. Okay, it's true, I would argue, but it's a different Shaila. I'm allowed to say differently. This is the Halacha L'Maisa according to the Ramah, which seems to be more in the world of the Ran and Rashi, but this is the Ramah. Yes, Rebelli.
Does it make any difference if there's no distinction between the cases?
If it's what?
I had a question about my Shalom Pocket trade this past Shabbos. Then the same thing happened again the next Shabbos. Same exact scenario.
Even if it's the same exact scenario, you could ask a different shaila and that Rav can give you a different answer. No problem. We're going to get there. Not premature, but we're going to get there.
According to Ramah, we're saying that it's a problem for the person to ask in this situation when it's the same shaila, or the Rav to answer the shaila.
Well, it sounds like, and this is why, although this is somewhat complicated, right, and going through the Ran in contrast to the Ravid and all the different nafkaminas, the reason why it's really straightforward is that I, as the one asking the question, I'm always allowed to ask a question, as long as I preface by saying, I already spoke to Rabbi so-and-so, and he said it's asur, right? Once I do that, now the achrayis is on the second Rav I'm speaking to. Let him go through the whole sugya. The passing like the Ran or the Ravid, go through the Ramah, the Shach. The Shach seems to be more in the world of the Ravid. The Ramah seems to be more in the world of the Ran. Okay. Now, it's interesting, the Aruch HaShulchan brings up a question which has bothered many throughout the centuries. This is in the bottom of page 4. The Aruch HaShulchan says, why is it we have an explicit Gemara in a few places in Shas, and none of the great poskim quote this Gemara? The Rambam doesn't bring it, the Torah doesn't bring it, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't bring it. The first source that we have in the authentic halachic literature is the Ramah that we saw. The Ramah brings it in Yoredeya. But why is it not quoted by the Rambam, by the Torah, by the Shulchan Aruch? Why is it left out? So the Aruch HaShulchan has a suggestion. He says perhaps this halacha of the second Rav not being allowed to paskin against the first Rav might not be so applicable bisman hazeh. The reason for that is, he says, nowadays, now he's writing in the very end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. He says, nowadays, everything is documented. Everything is in writing. We are the recipients of the Rambam and the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch and all of the Nosei Kelim and all of the Achronim and all of the Tshuvas Svarim. So likely, if I, the second Rav, want to paskin its mutter, I'm doing so based on a clear source. And if I'm paskening its mutter based on a clear source, that means you could argue the first Rav who said it's aser, right? So he made a mistake. He missed. It's a beferish tshuvas Rashba. It's true, this particular nuanced question was never addressed in the Shulchan Aruch, but it's a beferish tshuvas Rashba. He didn't see it. So the Aruch HaShulchan says it could be often the reason why the second Rav is allowed to pass it against the first Rav bisman hazeh, even lakula, is because most of the questions are not new shailas that demand a real, trail blazing within halacha. This has been spoken about somewhere. Find the source and paskin.
This is the Rambam. He didn't answer his question.
That's still sock shopping, no? That's sock shopping for a source.
Well, listen, his question is, why didn't the Rambam bring it? Why didn't the Torah bring it? So it could be what he's saying. I was making it more dramatic. Everything that we have bisman hazeh, it could be he was saying that's true even in the times of the Rambam. The Rambam in his introduction says, the reason why I'm writing the Rambam is because we have so many tshuvas of the Gaonim, even though he was one of the early Rishonim, but we have so much out there. The truth is, this is a suggestion. The Aruch HaShulchan himself seems to paskin like the Ramah, meaning to say that he himself feels the halacha of the Gemara still applies, and he's paskening like the Ramah against the Shach, that it's more about the Derech Eretz issue, and therefore the Aruch HaShulchan would say that even if the first Rav paskins lakula, it's not so simple for the second Rav to paskin lechumra, mishum kavodo shel rishon. Right?
How far does this extend? I mean, let's say you do have contemporary halachas farm today that are based on the gadgets that didn't exist back then or whatever it is. So, do we say that it's okay? Listen, you didn't see that other safer from this Rav that is lived 30, 40 years ago or whatever.
So these are all good questions. How far do you take it? And just because there happens to be one sefer out there that addresses the issue, and that sefer came out l'chumra, it doesn't mean that if you're a bar hachi and you went through the sugya yourself, you're allowed to paskin differently.
So the subsequent question is that let's say you look up the psak of the sefer, is that also considered binding? So let's say you're at home.
We're gonna get there as well. We're almost there. That's the Chazon Ish.
It feels like it legitimizes contemporary Rabbanim because nothing is new. Everything is just so any Rabbah gets upside. It's just about him having found a specific source for that child.
So it's a good question that it does seem to take away the whole mastery of Rabbanus, right? Now the answer might be that, listen, with all the sources in the world, still knowing how to decipher them and to go through the different poskim and to understand the background sugya that plays a major role, it's still far from pashut for anyone just to paskin, because I opened up the sefer and it says mutter asur.
Even if it's clear, just
Yes, and a lot of it is depending on if it's something that's not black and white, knowing who the person is, where are they holding, culturally.
to be an encyclopedia, just to every single shiloh that ever existed to know what it matches to is also incredible.
Yes, that's also incredible. Rabbi, I do want to finish up there a few more important points. Okay. Let's say where it's not a question that I posed to the first Rav and I'm asking a second opinion. Let's say I happen to be aware of the fact that there are a few opinions on the subject. So the Ramah says in Choshen Mishpat in Siman Chaf Hey, second line here of the Ramah on the top of page 5. Lo yomer adam efso kami she'ertze b'davar sheyesh bo machlokas. A person should not say, it's a machlokas anyway, and they're both valid opinions. I'll paskin the way I want to paskin. V'im osake, in such a powerful line. And if this is the way you live, where you hear their different opinions and you just pick the one you want to go with, harei zeh din sheker. This is hashkafa. It's halacha and it's hashkafa. It's a din sheker. Now, what does that mean? But I'm paskening like Rav Nisim Karelitz. Right? Do you know who Rav Nisim Karelitz was? I'm paskening like Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So how's it a din sheker? If they pasken that way, obviously it wasn't a din sheker. That's what they came out with from the sugya. That was their halacha l'maisa. But the Ramah is telling us that Yesod Gadol, you could have many different halachos. And elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, they're all valid. But so much of what determines an erlicha lifestyle as a real, authentic Eved Hashem is how I arrive at saying mutter or asur. If I'm just choosing the psak that's more convenient, or the one that feels better culturally, bein l'kula and bein l'chumra. Ramosha has that incredible tshuva where he says, don't think if you're being more machmer than you have to, then that's all good because it's coming from a source of religious fervor. It could be you're just being more machmer because you also have warped values. And every chumrah could lead to a kula. If the way you're paskening is based on convenience or based on just the way I feel, that's a din sheker. Okay, so then what is the general mahalach? How do I paskin in life, both in hashkafa and in halacha? So we have Pirkei Avos. We have two Mishnayos in the first parak of Pirkei Avos. The first one is from Yeshua ben Prachia, who says the famous line of Esei lecha Rav. You should make for yourself a Rav. And then we have a Mishnah in the same parak, towards the end of that parak, Mishnah Tazayin, Rabbi Gamliel, Asay lecha Rav, says the exact same three words. You should make yourself a Rav. V'histalek min hasafek. Then he adds three more words and says, and this way you'll be avoiding doubt. So the question, Bichlal, why do we have to have the same Mishnah twice? And what is Rabbi Gamliel adding when he says, Asay lecha Rav, v'histalek min hasafek? Histalik min hasafek means you'll no longer have a question. But isn't that pashut? Obviously, if I don't know if it's kosher or treif, so then I have a suffix. Once I ask the question and the rabbi tells me it's either kosher or treif, then I no longer have a suffix. What's the Mishnah adding? So the Rambam says, pshat in these two Mishnayos is the first Mishnah of Yeshua ben Prachia, Asay lecha Rav, is saying you should have a general misora, a general connection with the Rebbe. And that's in Hashkafas HaTorah. That's my general worldview. And the second Mishnah of Rabbi Gamliel is Asay lecha Rav. When it comes to how to paskin, I should also have a Rebbe. And it could be the same person, it could be a different person. Right? Sometimes in a yeshiva setting, a person will be very close with his Rosh Yeshiva, or very close with his mashgiach, and that's generally my go-to source for hashkafa and hadracha. And when it comes to psak, it could be there's a dayan, right? In Hasidish circles, you have the Rebbe, and the Rebbe is definitely the go-to for hadracha, but they also have a dayan, and the dayan's there to answer questions. So whatever your system is, you should have a system. What does it mean, v'histalik min hasafek? In the second Mishnah, when I have a rab to go to for halacha l'maisa, so then I no longer have a doubt. That means as follows. That means even when there's a legitimate suffix, it doesn't just mean a chisarun yediyah. I don't know what the halacha is because I never learned this before, so I want to ask my rabbi. There's a real suffix. A real suffix means there are major gedolim saying that this is inappropriate and it's usher. And there are major gedolim saying not only is it mutter, but everyone's encouraged to vote, right? You could have an issue that comes up where you have major gedolim both sides of the equation. So what do? I just want to do the Ratzon Hashem. And to start having discussions, right? Who are the gedolim that are making the mistake? Probably not a healthy avenue. So what the Mishnah is saying is, if you have a Rebbe, and you have this is my go-to person for psak, so then histalik min hasafek, that's how I navigate even a real suffix where there are two valid opinions. Comes along the Chazon Ish. We'll end with this. The Chazon Ish says that in general, when it comes to all these discussions of how to paskin, or like we mentioned, right, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says that if it's a suffix deraisa l'chumra, suffix derabanan l'kula, says the Chazon Ish, Nira, Tahadam b'shal Torah halach achara machmer, that which we say should be machmer when it's a shayla v'deraisa, eino ella b'she'ein echad mehem rabo. That's only true if neither opinion is your Rebbe. Avol echad min hachachamim hu rabo, but if one of the two opinions is my Rebbe, halach acharav af lahakel. Even if my Rebbe is saying that it's mutter, and it's a shayla v'deraisa, and I know there are other gedolei olam saying it's aser, you follow your Rav af lahakel. Okay, so who's considered my Rebbe? Mikre Rabo, kol shehu korov lo, anyone who's close to you, vishomeya shmuosav tamid berov hamitzvos. He's the person, he's the Rebbe that I'm getting the majority of my hashkafa and halacha from. Ubezeh im yesh shnei chachamim krovim lo. And therefore, the notion of having a Rebbe is not forced upon me. If there are two Talmidei Chachamim that I feel very close with, right? So they're both Korav Lo, V'Shomei Shmuosav Tamid, and I'm gaining a lot from both of them in the realm of either Hashkaf, Halacha, or both. So then, Rishus B'Yodo, Lahachzik B'Horosav Shel Echad Mehem. You have the option of choosing which one feels more matim for you, for your family.
You have to stick with that one. Meaning,
Ulahachziko karabo, and then you're machzikim as your Rebbe, meaning to say, "O halach achareihem tomid," I follow him, bein lekula, bein lechumra. Meaning, once I choose a path, this Mesorah, right, as shared with me through this Rebbe, so then the goal is not to continue picking and choosing throughout every shaila of life. That means I don't have a mahalach. That means I'm creating my own Yiddishkeit. But I want to stay with the hadracha of my Rebbe, bein lekula, bein lechumra. Bedin zeh, this is very interesting. This is true b'chayei hachacham, when the chacham is alive, ubein la'acher moso, or even if that person that I want to make my Rebbe is no longer living. Kol sheyodos harosav ilchosav mipi talmidav o mipi svarov. As long as I know what my Rebbe paskins, either through interactions and conversations with his talmidim or through reading his svarim very carefully, right? You have in the Sephardi world sometimes. You can have an 18-year-old Sephardi bacher where he never met Rabbi Ovadia in his life, but he could still very much be within the Mesorah of Rabbi Ovadia. Because Baruch Hashem, he learns from the Talmidim of Rabbi Ovadia, he learns from the children of Rabbi Ovadia, he learns from all of the Svarim. And if you want to take that on to be your Mesorah, bein lechumra, bein lekula, you're allowed to do that. V'hinei rishoyim laluch achar rabam, af lahakel b'shel Torah. The main chiddush here of the Chazon Ish is, even if it's a shayla v'deraisa, You're allowed to and you're encouraged to follow your Masorah, follow your Rebbe, even the Kula. Now, this doesn't mean, well, first what it does mean. What it does mean is, when we mentioned in the beginning, we've all heard the notion of don't go around shopping for Kulas. Am I allowed to ask a second and third opinion from the sugya we just learned? The answer is, you could. As long as you know what you're doing and you present the other psak that you got previously, you're allowed to ask a second and third opinion. And let's say you do so. And I'll leave it on that second or third Rav he'll make the cheshbon if he's allowed to paskin differently. I'll leave that upon him. And let's say he does paskin differently. So where does that leave me? Does that leave me closer to a Kadosh Baruch Hu or farther from a Kadosh Baruch Hu? So if the pshat is, this is what I always do, because ultimately I'm just looking for that psak that's more convenient or that feels better, so then the Ramah might call that lifestyle a din sheker. I might not be in violation of the Gemara Nida or Avodah Zarah, but the mahalach of life might be a din sheker. Rather, what is the hadracha? The hadracha is asay l'charav, and blame everything on him. And if he's wrong, I'm not responsible for that. He is. Now, if you happen to be a Talmud Chacham yourself, and you go through a sugya, right? I have this with who I would consider my go-to posek, and we've had a relationship now for more than 20 years with Rav Shmuel First from Chicago. Right? He'll be here next Sunday, Amir Hashem. There are definitely areas of psak where I go with him bein l'chumra and bein l'kula. And there are other areas of psak, and there are few, that I have a different opinion. Now, how are you allowed to have a different opinion than your Rebbe? The answer is, there's a shach also who says, we're not going to read it together, but at your leisure you could take a look. This is on page 4, Os Dalid. The shach says that if a person finds, through going through a sugya well, he finds a different angle than what are generally the klolei psak, or even a different angle than his Rebbe, he's allowed to paskin ma sheyira be'einav. He could paskin that which he seems to feel is true. Ein l'dayan ela ma she'einav rose. There's no such thing in Yiddishkeit that no matter what I find and no matter how deep I explore, I always have to do exactly what my Rebbe says. There's one major caveat though. Ein l'dayan ela ma she'einav rose, im hu bar hachi sheyodeya lahachriya ulahovin ulhoros. Assuming you know how to go through that sugya well. And in general, you have at least enough of a background where you might not be anywhere as great as your Rebbe is, but assuming you know how to go through a sugya well, you are allowed to arrive at a different conclusion. That's part of the richness and the dynamic nature of halacha. But generally speaking, I think these are the exceptions to the rule. In order to avoid a life of din sheker, we try to follow the Chazon Ish. Asay l'charav v'histalek min hasofik. Shkoyach.